So in May of 2021, The Economist magazine called Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth. And so in this video, we're going to unpack why they made that claim and discuss the factors contributing to the tensions that exist between China, Taiwan, and the rest of the world, and how that might spill over and have implications for all global politics and, of course, then our own understanding of the international world and the way that nations interact with one another going forward. So before we jump into a discussion about China and Taiwan, I think it's important to note that over the last couple of years, what might be deemed the most important place on earth has kind of shifted. And even as I record this here in April of 2026, so you might be listening to this even years later. I'm not sure how long I'll keep this particular lecture in circulation, but I'm recording this in April of 2026. And over the last couple of years, so in 2024, 2025, we might say that Ukraine and the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine might be the most dangerous place in the world because there's still ongoing conflict as I speak. There's ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Or we might actually then say, wait, no, probably the most dangerous place in the world is Gaza and the West Bank, where we have ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But in just the last couple of weeks, as I record this again in April of 2026, now we have a new conflict. We have American-led, American and Israel-led attack on the nation of Iran, and there's still no resolution to this conflict. And so while we can look at a long-standing tension between China and Taiwan, there are many places in the world where it is dangerous to live and where there's ongoing conflicts that threaten to spill over and cause issues on a global scale. So by the time you listen to this lecture, if you're listening after spring of 2026, you may be aware of even more conflicts happening around the globe. So, so while China and Taiwan are one region that are very important and critical to America, I do think it's important to recognize that there are many places in the world where there's ongoing conflict, people are dying, there's warfare, open bombings, and so refugees and so on. So hopefully by the time you hear this lecture, there will be some resolution in some of these matters, but as I record it, still ongoing conflict in many parts of the world. So if you don't know much about Taiwan, it's probably good to just give a general overview of what we're talking about here. So Taiwan is an island nation. It's roughly 100 miles from China off the coast. It covers about 14,000 square miles, so it's slightly bigger than the state of Maryland. Population, as of recording, is 23 million. The national language and the culture in large part is Chinese. So Mandarin Chinese is what's spoken by most people living in Taiwan. And Taiwan has a very close economic relationship with the United States. It's our 10th largest trading partner, behind Canada, Mexico, China, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Vietnam, and the UK. So we have very strong ties with Taiwan. And Taiwan is not only seen as a strong economic partner, they're one of our most important strategic military alliances as well. Even though, and we'll get to this later, even though the U.S. doesn't officially recognize Taiwan as a member of the United Nations, we do have very close ties with them. Just a general overview, but it's important to know that when we're talking about global politics, we're talking about the connections between the United States and its allies. The allied relationship between Taiwan and the U.S. is very, very, very important. So you might be wondering, what are the sources of tension between China and Taiwan? Well, it goes back to the Chinese Civil War. And on your screen, you can see a bit of a map here describing what sort of the breakdown is between the Chinese, or the Chinese communist, and the nationalist. On your screen, you get a sense of the red as representing sort of communist-controlled territories at the time of the Civil War, and in 1949. And then you have in the blue, you have more of the nationalist-controlled territories. So yes, China experienced a civil war in the 1940s, kind of sliding over into the 1950s, where communists were fighting for control of the nation. The nationalists were a sort of a pro-democracy movement led by their leader, Chiang Kai-shek. And so, of course, as we know today, the Chinese government is communist. And so we can, of course, observe that the communists won that civil war back in 1949. The nationalist forces fled to Taiwan at the end of the Chinese Civil War. And so Taiwan previously had been a Chinese territory. But the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and the leader of the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek, helped establish a government in exile, which he led for 25 years following that civil war. Officially, Taiwan is called the Republic of China, ROC, and they have functioned more or less as an independent nation since the end of that civil war. They have their own currency, they have their own government, they have their own diplomatic relations, they control their own borders. They have they even compete separately at the Olympics. In every way, they are their own independent nation. However, the country of China, the communist country of China that is governed from Beijing, has continued for the entire time since that civil war to continue to claim that Taiwan is officially part of China and should be under their rightful control. So Beijing views Taiwan as their territory and believes that they should have the rights to govern it, and are quite adamant about that point. And it reflects in how they deal economically with the rest of the world, including partners in the United Nations and the U.S., which has kind of capitulated to the Beijing government's request to not recognize or to not give Taiwan full status. So the leader of the Communist Party in China that helped establish what we think of today as the People's Republic of China, the communist party that controls modern day mainland China, was established on October 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. So the announcement ended the full-scale civil war that had been going on between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. Of course, then, as mentioned in the previous slide, Chiang Kai-shek leads the nationalists to Taiwan, where they regroup, and they had planned at one point to try to retake the mainland. That never occurred. And from the American perspective, this was a great defeat, because America did not want China. China had been an ally of the U.S. Um, previously during World War II, and the U.S. did not want to see China become a communist country. Of course, this is during the Cold War, so this was a big defeat from the perspective of the Americans. And Mao Zedong remained the leader and controlled the People's Republic of China into the 1970s. So initially, the United States didn't recognize the People's Republic of China. They would only deal with Chiang Kai shek's ROC, the Republic of China, based in Taiwan, and wouldn't recognize mainland Chinese communist government, um, and wouldn't allow for even a seat at the United Nations for the communist government there initially. But this really made diplomatic efforts between China and the U.S. nearly impossible. And so it was in 1972 that U.S. President Richard Nixon broke this impasse, and he visited communist China for the first time. And this led to the opening up of China to the rest of the world. And in 1979, the United States extended formal diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. And since then, it has almost solely focused its attentions on relationships with the People's Republic of China, and has, as I said, has really bowed down to the People's Republic of China's demands regarding recognition of Taiwan. So Taiwan now has become the disfavored of the two nations as far as diplomacy and international recognition is concerned. As far as military and economic ties, the U.S. is as tight with Taiwan as ever. They're still very important strategic partners. It's just that on the global stage, particularly regarding the UN, Taiwan has lost its status, whereas the People's Republic of China in mainland China has retained its status and is now what we think of when we talk about China and the Chinese government. So many people have called Nixon's visit to China in 1972 as the week that changed the world. And it is pretty amazing to think about how this initial opening in the early 1970s set the stage for what is now the most important diplomatic relationship globally, which is China and the U.S. I think that they are viewed as rivals. Thankfully, I think at least in some people's mind, thankfully in most people's minds, I would say that China and the U.S. are not seen as enemies at this point. But they are seen as rivals because they're the two most powerful economic powers in the world, probably the two most powerful military forces in the world. And so this relationship between Beijing and Washington, D.C. is really key. Anytime we talk about what's going on globally and we talk about international relations, it would be really a big miss for us to not place this at the center, because so much of what happens today in the world is focused around this relationship between China and the U.S. It was probably hard to predict. We knew that China was a large nation back in the early 70s. They had a very big population, but they were very weak economically, right? So they have always had a high population, but having a high population doesn't necessarily mean that you're a powerful or influential nation. But today we can say that China is both a very big country. It has a population of almost 1.5 billion people. So it's not only big, but it's also powerful, economically, militarily, influentially, both in the region in Asia, but even globally in Africa and Latin America, even Europe. So this is key. This is a centrally important topic if you're going to look at the globe and look at this topic of international studies. As we study this subject, it's important for us to recognize the central nature of this. So in 1979, the U.S. adopted the One China policy. Now, this is not the one child policy. You may have heard that. Again, a policy that's closely associated with China. The one child policy is a law that existed in mainland China for decades that limited families to just having one child. But this is the One China policy. And this is the moment when the U.S. Chose to recognize and to have formal ties with China rather than Taiwan. So China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province. So they see it as part of China, even though it, as I mentioned in a previous slide, it functions as an independent nation in almost every measurable way. But China believes that one day Taiwan will be reunited to the mainland. That probably won't happen without military intervention, but that is China's ambition. The U.S., of course, does not agree with this. They believe that Taiwan should be viewed as an independent nation of its own, although they chose to not recognize Taiwan on a international level with the United Nations. So any country that wants diplomatic relations with mainland China, they have to break official ties with Taipei, with the Taipei government in Taiwan. A few countries that still recognize Taipei and have diplomatic relations are countries like Panama, El Salvador, Nicaragua. So these are not very large, influential nations. The U.S. still maintains formal relations with China and only has unofficial relations with Taiwan. That can be hard to parse out sometimes from a distance, because it looks like, the U.S. has really strong economic ties with Taiwan. We have strategic military ties with Taiwan. So it's like, what is unofficial about that? Well, basically that means that top-level American diplomats, people like the president, the vice president, cabinet member, U.S. presidential cabinet members, and so on, typically they won't interact with leaders of Taiwan. We all know that there are back channels, there are ways that the U.S. and Taiwan communicate very effectively, and yet on the public side, the public-facing side of all of this diplomacy, there are really no high-level interactions that we know of or that are publicly presented. So Taiwan is a democratic. It's a democratic country. They have elections. The democratically elected president isn't allowed to make any trips to the U.S. So that's another way that this one China policy has been forced upon the world. The president of Taiwan doesn't get to go on delegations to visit other nations and interact with their leaders. So in a lot of ways, it's a very limiting force. This policy is a very limiting force on the leadership of Taiwan. And finally, as I've mentioned this before, but Taiwan can't belong to the United Nations. So I believe that Taiwan is able to send representatives occasionally to the United Nations, but they're not a seated member of the United Nations. So this is the way that China, mainland China, controlled by the Beijing government, the communist government of Beijing, this is how they've imposed their will on the rest of the world in regards to Taiwan. So what is the U.S.'s position as far as Taiwan goes? Well, currently the official stance on Taiwan is that that we are quite ambiguous about what the U.S. would do if China were to make some kind of a military-driven attempt to reclaim Taiwan or to in some way assert power over Taiwan. Many people believe the U.S. would respond. that they would step in, and the main reason for that is not because the U.S. wants to get involved necessarily, but because the U.S. has such deep economic and military ties to Taiwan. And by that I mean, Taiwan is famously one of our most important chip manufacturers for high speed processing, computer processing, the kind of chips that are necessary for AI, and making the most cutting edge computer technology. A lot of that is made in Taiwan, and so the U.S. has some really important economic reasons to want Taiwan to be a close ally and to protect Taiwan from aggression from China. The U.S. doesn't want Taiwan to be controlled by China, because then that kind of chip manufacturing and technological advantage would be basically advantage for China, a disadvantage for the U.S. If China is controlling what Taiwan does economically. So the U.S. State Department has said that though the United States does not have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, they do have a robust unofficial relationship, and the U.S. opened a $250 million embassy in Taipei in 2018. Now, this embassy is unofficial, so that means that it's not recognized as a U.S. embassy, but it's a U.S. representation in Taipei, which is the capital of Taiwan. The Taiwan Travel Act, which was established in 2018, allows for high-level officials of the U.S. to visit Taiwan, and vice versa, but not necessarily presidential visits and such. When the U.S. wants to kind of stick it to China, when U.S. diplomats are kind of fed up with maybe some behavior on China's part, then you'll see more aggressive action to recognize Taiwan, sometimes in unofficial ways. But the U.S. is quite aware of how much China wants to lay claim on Taiwan, and so one way that Taiwan becomes kind of a bargaining chip between these nations is that the U.S. often shows favoritism to Taiwan in moments when they want to put pressure on China or send a message to China that they're unhappy with them in some way. Just as an example of how this conflict plays out in real life, so we have had both students from mainland China and students from Taiwan here on our campus, and we've received complaints from our mainland Chinese students at times about any kind of display of the Taiwanese flag, because from the Chinese perspective, any display of the Taiwan flag is a recognition of, or maybe instead of a recognition, I should say a statement of Taiwan's independence from China. And from the Chinese perspective, Taiwan has no independence. That Taiwan is just another province, another part of China, and so we have received complaints whenever the Taiwanese flag has been displayed. Now, the opposite doesn't really occur. You don't hear Taiwanese students complaining about the mainland China flag being displayed, and that's because obviously they recognize mainland China as another country, so there's no threat to them by presenting that flag publicly. If you've never been to Taiwan, which probably most of you have not, but it's a really thriving country. It's a beautiful country. There's as I mentioned, Chinese is the main language, Mandarin Chinese to be specific, and the culture there is very unique because if you go to mainland China today, of course you can experience Chinese culture, but you also experience Chinese culture after several decades of communist rule, whereas in Taiwan you have a Chinese culture that has been able to thrive under a democratic system. So in some ways it's interesting to think about how the two, though they both represent Chinese culture, how those two cultures maybe create contrast with one another. And I probably shouldn't speculate too much on that contrast. I've spent a lot of time in mainland China, years of my life in mainland China, but I have only spent a little over a week in Taiwan. I only visited Taiwan once, so I don't think I know enough about the culture in Taiwan to speculate about how it might diverge from mainland China. One thing I would say is that the freedoms available in Taiwan are quite a bit larger than what you have in mainland China. So, in mainland China, access to the internet is limited through censorship. The media is censored, journalism is censored, all controlled by the Beijing Communist government. Whereas in Taiwan, they have a much more open society. The internet is not censored. The media is free, and journalism is open and free and protected. And so, just a contrast of these two nations, even though they both are very Chinese in both culture and language. And so, a fascinating contrast. So the tensions that exist between mainland China and Taiwan and the USA sometimes kind of rise and fall depending on what's happening globally. But this is an example from 2022 in which a general from China, General Wei, said that no one should ever underestimate the resolve and capability of China's armed forces to defend its claims in Taiwan. Um, he went on to say, for the sake of unification, the U.S. fought the war between the North and South, and China is most unwilling to go through a civil war like that, but will resolutely smash any schemes for Taiwan independence. If anyone dares to split off Taiwan, we will not hesitate to fight, will not flinch from the cost, and will fight to the very end. On the U.S. side of that discussion, during the Biden presidency, there were at least 4 recorded times when asked during interviews if the U.S. would intervene militarily to protect Taiwan from any kind of aggressive behavior from China. Joe Biden, the president, said that yes, the U.S. would be willing to use military force to protect Taiwan from mainland China, and to and to put our forces, our troops, into harm's way in order to defend the independence of Taiwan. And so you can see that the U.S. has made bold statements over time about what it's willing to do to help Taiwan maintain its independence. Now, as I record this in April of 2026, we're under a new administration. We're under Trump's second administration, and Donald Trump has not been as aggressive in addressing issues between Taiwan and China, but I think that's primarily because of all the other concerns that are going on around the world, which we mentioned earlier in this video. So he has a lot more to deal with currently in the Middle East, in Iran, in Gaza and Israel, and then also in Russia with Ukraine. So a lot of hot button issues going on globally for the Trump administration to be dealing with right now. And so whether they would be as aggressive in defending Taiwan is uncertain. I think that it'll be interesting to see how this relationship evolves over time, and to see if the U.S. continues to be so ready to defend Taiwan as China grows in its military power and its global economic influence. So one thing is for certain: if there was ever to be war between the United States and China over Taiwan, it would be quite brutal, and probably the most brutal and large-scale battle we might see between nations since World War II. So U.S. intelligence has shown that Chinese leadership preparations for preparations for invasion into Taiwan, and to be ready by 2027. Now, we don't know if this is training exercises or if there's any legitimacy to it, but with the U.S. currently, as of spring of 2026, currently involved in so many conflicts globally, it's interesting to think about what China might be planning. They might see this as a window of opportunity for them to take action in Taiwan, because the U.S. is so distracted by conflicts in other parts of the world. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But if it were to happen, I think it would be quite unfortunate, and would disrupt the globe in ways that we can't even really predict at this point. So I hope and pray that this is not a reality that we have to face, but it certainly is a threat and a risk that we have to take seriously. So one interesting side note to this is that MSSU has recently branched out and developed a new partnership with another sister university in Hangzhou, China. The university is called Zisu. It's a school of similar size to MSSU, and it's one that we're hoping to expand into with great partnerships going forward. So Zisu stands for the Zhejiang International Studies University, and we sent a group of students from MSSU to Hangzhou to visit the university. And in the summer of 2026, we expect a visit from students and faculty from Zisu University or Zisu School to come to visit the United States, to visit Joplin, and to be with us for several weeks during the summer semester. So this is a expanding partnership. It's one that I'm excited about. I love China. I'm excited for the connection to Zisu, and as much as we've talked about the potential for conflict, which is a reality, I do hope for great peace to be part of the future for our relationships with China and Taiwan.